UK team. Or rather, in a moment when I confirm that the sound is actually working. Today we are playing Dead or Alive, as is customary for our Thursdays. And this week we have a very specific thing to bring up, because the team is basically ready to move on to at least one new concept. One that they should be relatively familiar with in the game as a whole. Dwarf is once again playing Mila this week, channeling a bit more of that frustration and checking some other options relative to Bayman. See what we get. Other than that, you should be expecting to see the main suspects that you normally see playing the main characters that you normally see, so you can join in if you have the expectation of wanting to play against one of them. Note that this is a loser stays on lounge. It has a loss limit of 3 consecutive losses. We're generally fairly okay with it being slightly laggy, and therefore the connection to connect to the lounge doesn't need to be that great. Geographically, we figure most people within the Atlantic Rim, east coast of the US, certain parts of Europe, Caribbean, Northern Latin and South America should probably be able to get a decent connection if their internet is good enough. So feel free to join in on that. Last week we covered some minor new concepts for players in general. Some off a stream a little bit after with Team Alone, and some obviously on the stream itself. This week is about the concept of a shimmy. When you hear shimmy referred to in other games, particularly Street Fighter fans, it's specific to that game. By most people's standard, it has to do with getting the opponent to whiff a throw. But the term shimmy isn't really about making the opponent whiff only a throw. It's about making them whiff any move where you have a chance of being able to counterattack the recovery frames of that move, or walking back into this space to do something based on their recovery and them being off balance based on the fact that you got out of range and moved back into range. Generally, this is fully intended from the beginning of the movement. And this means that it can often be caught, because it is a movement, in 2D games, which have the standard high-low mix-up situation. A shimmy is often beaten by the player actually going for a low, often a medium low. This is often something that happens, as we say, on a wake-up in those games. In fact, there are so many things that are mildly different between the situation for the shimmy in that game and in this one that is unrecognizable to people who don't spend a lot of time in game analysis. And that's why we're probably going to be spending most, if not all, of our stream on it. So starting from the beginning, the most obvious thing a shimmy is meant to do is to get your opponent to do something that isn't in the right spacing. In order to do this, generally in this game, you will notice that you have a relatively poor backward walk speed if you're just walking, because mostly your character automatically blocks. This is compounded by the fact that most people don't throw as their first action in a situation like that in this game, and you have no good reason to just spam the throw button for the same reason. As we've discussed before, the throw button works a little differently here. Just hitting throw will not usually get you where you want to go. And as you can see, based on the range of throw itself, you can't usually walk back in quickly enough to throw the opponent after they've gone for that themselves. So this match is mostly about telling you what won't work, what doesn't happen. If you fought our Kasumi bot, you can actually probably say you've got some experience with this. Which is why I'm playing Kasumi today, because she is probably the easiest character to teach relative to it. This isn't to say that she's particularly better at it than most characters, in fact she's not that great at it, but she does have really obvious shimmies, and that helps with the explanation. Our other good way to explain this is through Honoka. So we're also going to see some of that, and you'll get discussions about the Honoka matchups you see. Chances are that a lot of the stream will be either Honoka or Kasumi doing something, and therefore you'll get to see something else. There are two things, one that should probably not be called a shimmy but is functionally the same, and of course the real shimmy itself. When fighting in a 2D game, the shimmy is done in the plane that you can do it in. You move back out of the way and step forward into the position. There are therefore two potential forms of the shimmy in this game. The first is obviously just to sidestep, and this could be considered not a shimmy, but the reason you consider the sidestep to be one is specific. The sidestep that is a shimmy is intended to dodge a quick move before you even began it, and specifically to hit out of it right after. This is usually done at basically the maximum range so that the opponent's other options become less effective. However, since many people just use standing punches in these situations, you're often still going to have the same effect. The important reason about the range is for the same reason that actual shimmies in other games, things that people call a shimmy, are important. Because in a sidestep, you can technically still be thrown, but if your spacing is just right, your opponent can't throw you. Particularly if you sidestep slightly backward. The game does not really, as mentioned, let you move particularly far backward when moving as a generality, and honestly when you're sidestepping it doesn't get that much better. But it does get a little better, and therefore you get to do something else. How close was that one? Not sure. This game also has knockdowns, but often you get full pressure on your opponent on a knockdown. So the timing for a shimmy is actually something else. And it ties well into the rest of the flow as well. So as not to distract from what is going on screen right now. We'll go into the full details of it a little later, but that's enough for explaining what it is, why it's done the way it is. In general, to shimmy, you are looking to sidestep backward in some direction at a particular range. A range that probably is just far enough for you to hit normally to make your opponent have to think about it. But also where you could sidestep back in and forward. You don't have to actually sidestep, you can just walk forward, of course, and get your hit. For this to work, of course, your opponent has to choose not to use a wide sweeping or tracking attack, and particularly not to use a tracking mid. So it again loses to mostly the same things. A sweeping, tracking low will lose, and a certain timing for a combo into a low often will defeat the shimmy. It is actually because of this that which side of the screen you're on affects how effective your shimmy is to some extent because of the directions you have to press, how quickly you can transition, whether or not you're likely to get hit by a mid or not, etc. This is purely executional on the part of the player and not really part of the game design precisely. The additional type is that you can also avoid the tracking lows by sidestepping and then backing off even more. This usually does not lead to a good whiff punish though, so you gotta be careful with it. Some characters have good whiff punishes at that point and some really don't. Honoka, as you can see, is a character that definitely has whiff punishes for most of them, because a lot of the longer range zoning style moves in the game do actually start fast enough to act as whiff punishes for those situations. Again, if you intended the shimmy from the beginning, you should have the timing able to do it. Most of us can't do it on reaction, and if the opponent decides to keep hitting buttons or use a combo that pushes them forward, often also making them more vulnerable, again, the shimmy can end up being defeated.
What? Does it really hurt that much?
But let's also discuss the general, more complicated way to shimmy. Many characters in this game have moves that pull back their own hurt box at the time of movement. And yet take a while to actually execute. It's best when these moves don't bring you forward as well. Depending on your character's throw range, they can hit with these moves and then shift. But more importantly, and Kasumi is good at what I'm about to explain. You can shimmy by hitting the max range of a move that does not actually knock your opponent down, or pushing them out with a block string. This is similar to what we call the auto shimmy in Mortal Kombat 11, and is similar enough to a tick throw that you could also consider it that to some extent. But whereas a tick throw works more or less whether or not the opponent actually does the thing you want, or it works if they're just defending. This sort of weird shimmy throw does not. Your opponent has to stick out a button or want to do something for this to work. The good part about this particular shimmy is the same reason that shimmies are good in any other game situation. It stops the opponent from wanting to do specific things. You have specifically created a space between you and your opponent that they should probably stick a button into, but don't have the correct button to stick. And in that moment of hesitation, you can either tap forward to go for your forward throw, or forward back, which is often helpful depending on your character's walk speed. Kasumi is good at this one. And avoid anything that's about to happen. This is also good for characters who have attacks that hit at long range but don't combo at that range. Understanding that you can hit at a range, know that nothing can happen after that. Your opponent will either go for a hold because they expect you to hit another button. Holds do not always extend the other character enough to get thrown, by the way. But they'll either go for a hold block, in which case your throw will whiff, but often without too much of a problem unless they were really expecting it. Or of course they stick out that button that you were counting on and you grab their hand or their foot or whatever. This is a good alternative to trying to whiff punish with buttons, which generally tends to require a much more skilled targeting of the attack, and often because the button you want to use at that range has to be long and relatively slow itself. Whereas throw boxes work as basically has your opponent stuck any part of their body within your throw zone, and now you've got them. Helena is good at this as well because she spends so much time putting people at a very precise space. Her kicks in particular set this up a lot situationally. This means that for Kazuki Dynasty in particular, kicking people, realizing that they have blocked or whiffed, and then landing the throw is relatively easy. This is what helps people who play Helena to keep opponents on the defensive. With her main problem being as always that she has to get in close enough to get any of this started. But because she has that range and can easily stand at a perfect spacing on your knockdown and not have to do anything, she gets more out of this than many characters. Meaning that, as I noted before, in this matchup, Mila basically wants to be really close so that she doesn't have to respect all of Helena's stuff. The Helena player, therefore, is often watching exactly where she ends up at the end of you blocking a kick string or a pushing back kick move or similar, because she really needs to know, can you reach me from here, and if you try and are wrong, can I grab you? She's absolutely capable of whiff punishing with buttons, but honestly it's not as effective for most matchups in most situations. She gets more out of many of her throws, and in fact has an entire build in which she goes into a really long throw out of her stance to get this done. No, of course, as I said, the other side to this is simply that the opponent will keep doing a full combo, generally a jab one to be very quick about it. But there's an upside to this. Nearly every character in the game that does this, the second hit is a high. Just almost universally. And no one has time to think about not doing the high either. Meaning that generally, when Helena has done this, if she expects that it's not going to work, that the opponent is just going to hit buttons, she can hold high or in some cases mid. And the thing is, you can usually learn pretty easily and quickly which one to hit.
That was a great fight.
So just one more manipulation on that list of things. Oh, for a moment there I thought Santero's thing told me today. And that adds our third character who has the Kasumi style auto shimmy. You've already seen this demonstrated in Ayane play recently. Specifically, Ayane has a couple of good leaping throws that do actually grab onto and beat an opponent who thinks that it's the time to hold. Similar to Kasumi's flip onto shoulders, but with a little more direction to it and a little bit harder to crouch under or move under.
No way. I'm giving this all I got.
This works decently well because Ayane also has a fairly large number of moves in neutral that strike the opponent without actually knocking them down, but her follow-up moves are also very long. And she doesn't generally want to make herself too vulnerable by using the very long ones unless she's confident that the opponent is twitchy. So good pokes at people's feet one way or another are often helpful. If you find that your character has a low punch that doesn't seem to go into anything or do any damage, this is generally what that move is for. It's a way to clip your opponent to make them definitely be in recovery and have to think about things. You reposition with your advantage frames and then assume they go, oh, you didn't keep attacking, I should probably stop you, maybe I'll hit a button. Since you're never close enough to throw, no one defaults to throwing you. And then you simply beat them with the correct throw. Or, again, by using the original thing we were talking about. A slight side step backward, and then a strike or sometimes a throw into the space. You generally want to strike because most throws at that range are still kind of off. The ones that tend to reach are longer startup, so you often need to do those from the very beginning. You can see how it's relatively easily based in the fact that once your opponent sees you hit them, even if they've seen before that the move doesn't necessarily combo into anything, they can't be completely sure. This is almost completely true when the move does normally combo, but you were too far out. you're the one that knows, oh, that's not my spacing, I was too far out. Your opponent has to learn to recognize this over time in full stress situations. It's extremely unlikely that they're going to know offhand that that was the exact wrong range, especially if they were not the one moving. If they were defending before that point, they might notice, but they're not the one likely to be confused. They're the one more likely to be confused in the situation. You are probably not. With this game's very high number of moves and large variety, this also comes up for related reasons.
You won't tell anyone.
If you are poking at the opponent with moves they are not familiar with, the general natural thing to do for their side is to block. You can't necessarily know that the hold will work if you can't tell what to hold. This actually makes the match between Kasumi and Ayane very complicated in that regard. To the point where sometimes it can look quite choreographed. Neither character is necessarily completely dedicated to the idea of doing a specific combo. There's a lot more variation and a lot more gaps between what they actually do and what you'd expect in terms of their offensive potential. If you have long combos that leave you fairly advantaged, or clip your opponent and the range looks good, the opponent blocks. Noting, of course, that this doesn't generally work in the case of blocks then, and as we mentioned before, this is still more so a shimmy. It isn't, I have hit a button and then gone for throw because I think my opponent is blocking. It is specifically, I have hit a button that my opponent come to the conclusion that I have stopped attacking, and now I'm going to throw them because they're probably going to finally hit their own button. This allows them to switch up and become one of the trickiest characters in the game on both sides. Specifically because they never actually need to do a bunch of stuff. Lowering your own predictability in this way can really help. For example, you'll note that many of the break holes in this matchup didn't go anywhere. High unpredictability affects more than just the neutral. Characters will also spend more time being able to do different things on wake up. that isn't in itself a reason to shimmy. Adding stress to your opponent only works if they're the type who has not played against your character a lot, for example. And as you get better and better at the game, you should generally assume that people are going to keep up with you at least a bit.
This is your last chance to run away.
Fight!
Ayane also has many more sweeping moves at decently longer range than most characters, meaning that she can start the whole concept of the shimmy far earlier. And with even more ambiguity. The aforementioned moves that swing your hurt box back or do something evasive, those are again not truly shimmies, that's more of a read on your opponent's action. Often on an instant action you're expecting on their wake up. So one more time, remember that the shimmy is more so often about giving the opponent an opportunity to come to the conclusion that you're not going to attack. Have them whiff an attack, either because you were out of range naturally, or you specifically chose based on an expectation from there. While those things are functionally the same in practice, when you decide, I think my opponent is going to wake up or start their offense with this punch, and I can duck under it, I'll low profile the punch and everything will be fine. Again, it's important to do this mentally as a distinction because the shimmy requires that you specifically position yourself to make them think that it was their turn to attack. The reason this is important is mostly because the things that beat that and the things that beat high profiles and so on are not the same. The player going up against you as you do this gets different feedback in different ways. If you've decided, well, I'm at close range, I'm going in for what looks like pressure on wake up, but I think my opponent is going to wake up with something else. What you've done is created a situation where your opponent guesses and you guess, and sometimes they win. This is the problem. In the shimmy situation, your opponent doesn't win using any of their quote-unquote normal options. None of their good ideas or stuff that leads to big damage. you don't really give them the option for that. You're out of range of all of those moves by nature. Unless, of course, they're really risky ones and super long, and probably you could just hold those or not even do anything.
Let's go. That was a great fight.
And this is why, so often, we bring up the shimmy in context of the whiffed move that gets grabbed. Your opponent was going to whiff the move either way. And because you didn't see the startup of something else even longer, you know this. If you get really good at it, you can almost sometimes make sure that even those moves will whiff, and you'll get the same result. Now, the ability to high profile or low profile your opponent's attacks based on this can be used in the same way, but just bear in mind that your opponent should basically never have been able to win with any quick or probably good immediate idea attack. The sort of thing that would let them get out of your pressure if you decided to pressure them generally should not win in the shimmy. And the game shows us, not necessarily on the stream screen, but I'm reminded most throws and offensive holds do track. Not only that, but any attacks that land while a fighter is sidestepping become counter hits. So sidestepping, to throwing a sidestepping opponent is a big amount of damage. It's a big deal.
I cannot lose this.
This is why it's so important to do this correctly, because if you're in the wrong spacing for the shimmy, you get thrown, and then you're in trouble. Let's look at this now with two relatively zony characters. Helena doesn't get most of the same options against Elliot for the same reasons, because Elliot's moves will barely clip the edge of where she thinks is a good idea to do things. The problem is that Elliot always has the same options at these spaces and makes it incredibly easy to hold. This is why Helena doesn't really benefit from being closer to Elliot. She doesn't need to be. Elliot is often the one taking some risk, even though it's relatively small. Helena can usually mid-hold, or in certain cases, certain very specific, really telegraphed cases, high hold, because Elliot doesn't really use very many highs, it's like one move. There's also, as you've just seen, a lot of opportunities for her to do things while Elliot is retreating. And mostly, she actually cares about keeping Elliot away from her, because once Elliot is close, things get harder. This is often why she has to back out during those spaces, and why her meter ends up being so effective. A good way to keep the situation from getting out of control when the Elliot player is ready to take a risk finally. But sidestepping always helps due to the generally linear nature of Elliot's quicker moves. Basically, I'm not even sure she can normally be hit at a certain range. Elliot has like one option. It's not very damaging, but it is at least consistent, so the Elliot side should generally look to use that type of punch whenever needed. But back to discussing Monika's way of doing this. This is one that works particularly well against Elliot. The one we have started our discussion with is probably the strongest one. The slight back sidestep. This is again because Elliot has fewer moves that track properly in this situation, and some of the most predictable advancing strings in the game.
Please, give it your all.
Of course, understanding that you have to hold Elliot differently than most characters comes in there. I did specifically say that most characters in that spacing hit with highs, and Elliot is one of the few that doesn't. So you end up holding Elliot's mid punches whenever there's a "you're coming forward now" situation. But as you can see, the other options are usually either unsafe or just not very damaging. The hard part is being ready for it, because most other characters you don't even think that they're going to be attacking yet from the range Elliot starts many of these attacks. So it's difficult to go, oh right, this particular character requires me to expect an attack from much further out, and therefore I must position myself much further out in order to shimmy. Fortunately, as you get faster and faster at these games, Elliot's main longer range attacks are really telegraphed. Which is partially why, despite being a zoner in nearly every way, if the opponent decides to not advance, Elliot has so many good ways to get in close using those same zoning tools. Once it's done, you can't really say that Elliot's playstyle changes. He does a certain amount of damage, and then resets the situation, often by knocking the opponent so far back that it leads to an optimal situation. Aside from being sidesteppable, a lot of them are actually relatively disadvantaged, unless Elliot backdashes right after them, and even then probably not that great. The move that you use to quickly start your own punish combo, it's unlikely that Elliot's going to manage to backdash and then still get into position in time to do anything about it. Kasumi has a bit more trouble with this, because Kasumi actually doesn't deal with attacks from that range as well. She's what we often say to be a character with light hitboxes. The way that the moves work result in a lot of, oh, I am in a trade now, and it's not usually a particularly advantageous trade. She does have two main options that you're about to see in the shimmy, but at this point you're getting into Eunice territory. It doesn't really feel like a shimmy so much because it happens so far away. But do understand that nearly everything that achieves this specific goal is still a shimmy. As demonstrated here. As you can see there, her buttons don't always do this job that well. So she has to make use of the fact that her longest attacks are actually really long. If she misses, Elliot manages to punish it with a very little effort. See? This can lead to some frustration for Kasumi players because you spend a lot of time trying to outmaneuver a character that punishes you heavily for making tiny spacing mistakes. But the obvious answer is, as was described before, shown off by Honoka. You don't really have to fight Elliot at that range if you don't feel like it by just not doing anything. Because at some point, Elliot must attack, opening himself up to basically that and similar related moves. It is important to understand that this sort of thing works whether you have the life lead or not, because the other player understands that your character has more damage output at that range than theirs does. Elliot's moves are more so to stun the opponent long enough to get him into range, especially if they make mistakes. But if you don't make any of your own, Elliot plays a lot more in the style, if you're a Street Fighter player, of Guile, ready for a lot of things, able to keep situations in his favor, but once he's lost it, you're going to push yourself into a certain style of play that he's not particularly good at. If you are a Street Fighter fan and have seen a lot of Guiles go into dash, up, crouch, jab, well, that's usually a desperation measure. Jumping into crouch jab is completely different because you can hold down that through your entire jump and be ready to instantly EX flash kick on landing and similar. But dashing is a different beast. When Guile dashes, he's usually committing to something. And he doesn't often have a lot of situations where it's not telegraphed because he can't afford to wiggle around in neutral. Elliot has similar problems. Elliot can't afford to just randomly hit buttons in neutral because none of them are misleading enough to make most people go, okay, I don't know what to do here, maybe I should hang back. Most people go, that's not going to hit me, or haha, you've missed, I'm going to hit you now.
This is your last chance.
Making walking forward with the character quite difficult.
No hard feelings.
let's take a break from all that to discuss Mila defense. We discussed last week that in general, if Mila is close to you and you are blocking, hold early and hold high. Because she will generally poke the hell out of you, and she will manage to reach her complex moves, other combos, mids, and whatever else if you don't hold fairly early into the string. The thing to understand is that you only need to block one hit. Literally the moment you have blocked anything that isn't a kick, hold high. And honestly, if you block the kick, 90% of the time you can hold mid-kick. But those do tend to lead to more complicated outcomes, so I'm not necessarily suggesting that outright. The hard part is, of course, learning to hold within that very short time period. The downside on the Mila side, as demonstrated before and is technically being demonstrated now, is that she literally has to poke you to death with tiny bits of damage if she doesn't get into that optimal position, meaning that every time you manage to hold and get her away from you, her struggle starts over. This character is heavily on bobbing and weaving and using her good walk speed and similar options. Sometimes it's okay to just poke the opponent to death if you expect things to work out fine. But as you see, she can evade through a lot of things, hit some nice quick, low style attacks, and really, compared to many characters, she actually does move really quickly on her feet. Many characters move far. Mila moves fast. And the distinction is something you eventually have to understand if you're going to build up your skills in this game. A character that has a long backdash has less variation than a character who has a very fast backdash that covers the same space in the same amount of time, but only if they choose to actually backdash that far. It is that which makes this character such a nightmare to deal with for people who have two shimmy, in fact, because she can move through and around things so fast that you don't have a clear idea where she is. So that is basically Mila's actual option for neutral. She doesn't really have to play close in to win matches, it's just a lot more work and sometimes a lot more frustration because, again, it's similar to Kasumi. When you get it wrong, you tend to get hurt pretty badly for getting it wrong. But it's still a good way to spend your time focusing. Especially if you've got a good read on how your opponents move or what they want to do with their time, or just good reactions. Either one will usually do.
Don't make me laugh.
Most characters in this game are not able to do this quite as well because quick reactions doesn't mean as much when you're fast, when your better moves for those rangers are like 15 frames. Mila's sort of the same, but at least she gets to move forward really quickly both in movement and in punching. So you get extra opportunities to put your opponent on guard at minimum. It also helps that because the second hit of her combos is the predictable one, and your opponent often must block it if you happen to be at the right spacing. Let's say you're slightly far out, you throw out the first punch, it whiffs, the second punch makes contact and they end up blocking it. Now she's at the perfect position to actually be confusing, to be not easy to hold, to even stop maybe and go for something else, and so on. This makes the advanced version of this match fairly interesting, because Mila basically gets to move forward a lot, freight train style, while Helena is sidestepping. This generally means that Helena has a difficult time executing the correct options when Mila starts to attack without holding. But she has one simple advantage. Whereas with everyone else, they're generally worried about Mila getting close, and having to hold right then. Helena is more of a, I'm just going to hold high when I see you move. If you did not raise your leg at me, high hold generally is enough. This is because Mila can't afford to use too many half measures. She can't decide, okay, I'm gonna feint and move forward a little bit and see if I can fake her out, because you can't fake Helena out that way, she will kick you. See? Other characters absolutely will have more trouble if Mila just throws out a kick, punishing that kick. Helena is not on that list of characters. Many characters do have the standing high kick, capable of doing something, capable of just, you know, getting a tap. The important thing is that this is part of Helena's game plan to begin with. Once she lands that tap, she is at what she considers an advantageous situation. Everyone else is just like, I tapped you to stop you from getting in on me, but that's not really where I want to be either, so it didn't serve me any purpose. It's important to remember this for characters as a generality. What is a strong move on one character might be a weak move on another character, not related to anything in terms of combos, but simply where the character wants to be in the first place. Helena wants to be there. Her options start from that tap with that high kick to the head. Other characters just don't have as many options from there, so they don't get as much in terms of their flow out of landing that hit on Mila. And that takes us back one more step. Mila doesn't want to get hit with that kick, so she can't half measure her approaches. She's either coming in or she isn't, for the most part. And as we mentioned before, the amount of damage Mila does when she's not going in with stronger attacks. If you're really good at confirms, you can get higher damage, but it's hard. At this level, it's hard. Her longer moves also tend to slowly push her back out, which is exactly where Helena wants her to be, and not where Mila wants to be. This is compounded by the fact that against Helena's Bokuho stance, Mila doesn't have a lot of really good options that aren't telegraphed, and Helena can move quickly enough in that stance that she can get out of some of them. Fortunately for Mila, she's good enough at cornering other characters that she can often negate Helena's Bokuho stance movement, which loops us all the way back to one of the things we say about Helena most often. Get to the middle of the stage and stay there, because the moment you get cornered against at least half the cast, you are not only at disadvantage, a lot of your tools stop working. Not just you can't walk backward or you can't control space, you actually have moves that lose some purpose in the situation. Honoka doesn't face as many problems against Mila for a similar reason, although it does involve taking quite a few more risks. If you're not terribly afraid of being poked to death though, the fact that Honoka's general attacks, her hops and similar, do a really powerful job against Mila's kicks mean, once again, that Mila tends to decide I'm either coming in all the way or not. The fact that these moves, when hit by her punches, don't lead to combos makes it even easier. This isn't to say that Mila has a ton of problems in the matchup, but mainly that one of her stronger options for keeping the opponent confused get diminished a lot. If you're good at whiff punishes, Honoka is also able to use her own mid-kick to punish similar to how Lena can, but you might not be able to get the combo every time. Leading back into where we were starting the stream, shimmying. You should probably expect that this is where that sort of situation gets born. The opponent sticks out a button, you have a button of your own to use, but because their hurt box was extended from its normal place, they stick out a limb, and therefore you hit them, but you didn't hit them like solidly hit them. You didn't hit them the way you're used to hitting. You clipped them, more or less. And after clipping someone, you have to make a decision about what to do to press the attack, even though they might think, it might be my turn. Or to go for a sidestep or throw that takes advantage of the fact that they think it's their turn. You can definitely see it a lot there. Honoka definitely has some kicks where if Mila sticks out her leg and gets hit, nothing really happens after that. And Honoka doesn't have a whole ton of powerful advancing moves. One of the few she has will probably get held, so now what? Worse yet, this basically only applies to Mila's kicks in the first place. Her punches tend to recover in ways that don't involve her getting kicked that much. There are two ways to deal with this from the Honoka side. The first is to just let the Mila player attack. You don't really have to try to win that situation. If you are capable of whiff punishing Mila kicks and keeping her out, then just keep whiff punishing Mila kicks until you win, rather than put yourself at risk. Your other option is, of course, to come up with a way and timing to get the throw done. And Honoka does have some really good throws for the purpose, so it isn't as if this is a terrible way to go about it. The important thing is realizing where exactly you need to move to, because, again, going through the sequence, you get an advantage by kicking Mila's leg or whatever. You leave just enough space that Mila thinks, oh, I should attack here because this is an opportunity for me, and then you grab the outstretched limb, or you kick it again. Meaning that sometimes you just want to stand there directly, or sidestep without even going backward. And sometimes you just need to pull your character back only for a moment before moving forward again. This helps because it prevents the opponent from going for anything really crazy, and puts you out of range often of the second punch in her string at that range. We've already covered Elliot for this discussion. Oh, well then we won't have to do that. Brad Wong is functionally a living shimmy. This is common for Drunken Master characters. That's the point of Drunken Master style. Your opponent cannot read your movements, they cannot easily read your range, and they don't have a full idea of what you're trying to do in the first place. It makes them good at dodging, but not always good at damage. It does, however, lead to really unconventional offense that gets to continue for long periods. You can use Drunken Master characters often to disrespect your opponent by putting them off guard.
We settled this.
And in this small space stage, it's going to be even harder. Kasumi has to count on the second hit of a ton of her combos to even hit Brad. And if Brad reacts correctly, the second hit whiffs, and everything goes wrong. So your goal should generally be to get to a position where you're trying to land the second hit of whatever your attack is. Fortunately for Kasumi, she has at least enough variation in the second hit of whatever she wants to do that you have the option to mislead the character. It may not work because she has placings that don't lead to anything. But that's just the matchup. Brad should continue to use that option, continue to look at the incoming Kasumi and go, okay, I'm gonna sort of guess. I want to take my chances that this will beat your attack. And if he guesses even remotely correctly, it's not quite as much a guess in the normal sense. When you talk about guesses in most games, you're thinking 50-50. It's more so tilted toward Brad's side in this case, considerably so, leading to a lot less damage on Kasumi's side for the similar reasons. With the only real work you have to do from Brad's side being to not react too early. And that is what gives Kasumi her actual opening that follows up. If Brad is trying not to react too quickly, she may end up with at least the opportunity to go for the throw, to just dash straight up and try to throw. Most of her throws are not effective because he'll duck out of them or change his spacing or something, and you'll still manage to land the hit anyway, as shown there. So don't spend too much time thinking about, okay, I'm gonna find the moment and dash up and do this. It's more so for the exact same timing where you think your opponent is stressed out about reacting. A good timing to do it psychologically is just after they've realized that they did react too early. If you didn't do anything in that space, but your opponent moved at all, the long animations Brad's moves have often mean you can definitely run up and get your throw then, and because it will often beat his sidesteps or dodges, except like one, you don't have to worry about the idea that he will do a second portion of the same move and usually duck under your attack, or just fall under your attack entirely. In many situations, Brad will at least lessen the damage taken by various opponent options simply by reacting correctly, because he'll be so loose that he just gets knocked over instead. When he wants to advance, he has, of course, deceptively long forward punch normals to use. His kicks are usually not quite so devastating. They're more so when you think you have a read on your opponent's zoning tool or their spacing keep out idea, whatever that is. Maybe they'll try to backdash away from you or whatever, and you use the one that has two parts. And if you think they're coming at you, you use the hop and similar. If you've never played Absolver, you might want to give it a try. It's a very similar feeling building your decks and styles in Absolver. People spend a lot of time trying to get Drunken Style from one Jin Meska. The other good thing about Brad is that Brad's combos, for the most part, are intuitive to offensive players. They give them enough time to think about what needs to be done. Remember that Drunken Master style is not really about being completely uncontrolled. It is using the pivot points in your body in ways that other people don't intend to use theirs. There's less rigidity involved. Often with the expectation you will get hit and just win the fight by hitting more, or harder, or whatever. With the key being timing. I can't speak to historical use of this style because I would figure personally that if you did use something the equivalent of I'm fighting while drunk, that your reactions would be slowed, but it's also entirely possible that if this is actually done while drunk, the movements are designed around that. None of the movements in question are specifically intended to win by being faster, rather by being evasive and confusing. So it's not necessarily required that the person doing it actually react all that quickly or react all that well. For example, the lean backward you just saw, in a more rigid stance, would result in the fighter being hit in the face, because who leans back in the middle of actual regular fighting with the expectation it will work out? One benefit, therefore, is once a hit is landed, Brad is much better at converting that hit than many other characters. And extremely difficult to read in terms of what exactly he's planning to do that with. Even if you get used to Drunken Master style as a totality, the delays between the moves help in a similar way to the delays between Kasumi's moves. You know something is going to happen, but you're already on edge thinking about what it is. Which leads a lot of players to take the response of, I'll just keep defending until you make a mistake. Which is effective. But how do you convince a Drunken Master to make a mistake? And how would you know if it was one when they made it? Usually it is, of course, that they've done some move that leaves them at disadvantage in some blatant way. But, as I said at the very beginning, Brad is kind of just automatically a shimmy. You being hit at some range doesn't mean you understood the range you were hit at. And if you happen to not understand the range you were hit at, and blocked, and went for a counter move, then you could easily whiff. Or the combo could not really be over. The result of this is actually that Honoka has a much harder time with this character at this level than most. Because Honoka relies on being able to hit things fairly precisely, and most importantly to know when she has done it in a way that lets her do her combos. Because her moveset is so built around putting together specific strong things, she really needs to be able to convert one into another with some precision, and Brad stands against this in nearly every fashion. One good option for Honoka, though, is to recognize that she has a good throw range, she has good throws, and Brad doesn't particularly deal well with being thrown after whiffing. Whereas other characters have to extend themselves fairly far in order to get their damage, Honoka gets her better combos from a range slightly outside where that's a good thing. Which is also better because standing inside that range just puts her in that exact situation. Brad is doing confusing things now, and Honoka does not know what to hold, she does not know what to press. She doesn't even know if the combo's over. But understanding the right hold, or the right throw, are still fairly critical to this matchup. And the number of crouching throws she has to do don't match nearly any of the rest of her play or play style. Fortunately for her, once she does manage to land a throw, Brad is almost always at disadvantage both in spacing and in timing. She can freely go on the offensive or wait for him to whiff an attack and go for her own thing. This is partially because of her good forward walk speed and decent dash speed, but it's also because she just doesn't need to commit to as much in neutral. In fact, Honoka can fight nearly this entire match without hitting any buttons. If you're really good at it, your opponent will never actually block anything you do because she will always just be either hitting or throwing. With her big downside coming in that moment where Brad outright dodges the throw, as she basically can't do anything then. If you've misread the situation and used the wrong throw, you're usually in trouble. You could say that Honoka doesn't have many tracking moves, and that's part of it. But it's more so that her tracking moves, because she does have them, aren't good moves to use in the situation she puts herself in against this character. So she has to commit to poking away, hoping for the best, trying to understand what's going on until she can land the throw long enough to get some advantage going. Fortunately, that goes back to the same thing we were talking about yet again. If you do this whole shimmy thing correctly, trying to grab your opponent's outstretched limb and failing, I mean, it telegraphs to them that that's what you were trying to do, but you don't usually get hurt for doing it. Meaning she can spend a fairly large amount of time just trying to grab Brad's outstretched leg or arm or whatever, failing completely and it not mattering one bit. This match has of course gotten fairly tense though, given the matchup level, the difficulty that she faces, and, more importantly, the specifics of the flows that Space Wolf uses. Being able to advance without committing or without telegraphing that you intend to do so, and having moves that are ambiguous until they reach nearer the end of them, really helps against Honoka because of that required precision. We've now covered most of the matchups for the night, given that probably if we go into grad things in more detail, it'll end up being more so next week. But we do have one more aspect of the shimmy to talk about for those who followed along so far in every way. If you feel as if you didn't get it, we'll probably talk about it again, because as our players move through learning the concept itself and how to execute it, it tends to get pointed out and sometimes revisited. But if you're pretty sure that you just followed on and everything makes sense, we can mention one more thing. And if you didn't feel like that, don't worry about it. Watch us again later, or we'll come back to it, or whatever. This game, of course, has holes in it. And we often teach people, put your opponent at a spacing where you know what move they're going to do, so you can hold it and not have to worry so hard. But that's never completely true, because we're always just going with, okay, we've reduced their options to 2 things, and I'm partially guessing and partially doing psychological stuff. This is one way to take both of those things out. So you don't have to guess, and you don't actually have to understand your opponent's psychology. One of the most important things to understand in any game is that you can get to a point where your opponent's only good option, the only option that does any real damage to you, is obvious. But the purpose of the shimmy is not to go, well, in this moment I guess you're going to use that. It's specifically because your opponent has some move that is advantageous to them to do. You set up the situation for them to be able to do it, and they've automatically done it or not done it. You could say that there's still some small psychology in this, but if you've taken away all their other good options, especially if you've been shimmying so far, it's basically the next level of it. It usually involves going further back, which means it is often the sidestep back version, rather than any of the other options you had so far. To make that simpler, let's assume that the opponent is going to go for a mid-kick because their mid-kick gets something started. Whether it be position that they like, a combo that they can confirm on counter hit, something that pushes you into position they want on the screen, whatever. Normally, your opponent looks for a timing in neutral or after you whiff to land this medium kick, or to take you by surprise at close range with this mid kick. We're not talking about those situations. Today we're specifically talking about the situation where the mid kick is basically the only thing that will reach, but you have put yourself at the spacing where it's a good idea to hit it. If you blocked that mid kick, you definitely won't get hurt for blocking it. If they whiff the mid kick, you probably can't do a lot other than grab them in perfect timing. But there is a spacing at which it's just a good idea to do this kick. This has come up in many things before, in fact. To hit one button, put yourself in the range of someone else's attack, and then hold that attack. In this case, the position is off a little bit. You're repositioning out because you know you're not going to hit that crouching, like, you're not going to hit down punch. It's not going to be enough damage. But if I have managed to get to the point where you think you should now hit the kick. You've had enough time to recognize the situation. You've had enough time to recognize that my offense has stopped. And I am now standing at that perfect spot where you think, oh great, mid-kick, this is my starter, this is where I get to do things. And then you hold. Again, it's not really guessing and it's not really psychology. Mid-kick is the example I use because it's most often the correct thing here. But these sort of rolling sweeping kicks also do a really good job, and from your perspective it's the same thing because they're also, almost always, also mid kicks. Melee in particular is helpful here because hers aren't even mids. The correct kick to do at that space for melee is a high kick, meaning that you can keep with your rule of just generally hold high, and it will solve your problem. You just actually got to see the moment even though I messed it up. This is often a thing that happens after break holds, because break holds tend to put you on the other side of the opponent, and almost invariably the best thing for your opponent to hit at that range, unless they managed to use the break hold when they were near a wall, is their own mid kick. And you will almost always have barely enough time to hold that. And nothing else. Now, again, of course, your opponent might not attack directly after their break hold. But that's why we're specifically talking about it. If you move back and possibly sidestep just a tiny bit after being subjected to a break hold, your opponent's options decrease to basically step forward and use the mid kick because they don't know if you're going to keep walking backward. And this is probably the most complex part, but the core of it in that position. Shimmies are based heavily on the fact that your opponent doesn't know if you're going to keep going backward. In games that are much faster, where they could whiff and you could punish the recovery outright, and so on, sure, it has less of an impact, but definitely in this game, the fact that your opponent doesn't know when you start to move away if you're going to keep moving away is where a lot of the mind games in this come from. When someone is walking in on you, you have more options. You can hit the kick right away, keep them out at that range and hope for the best. Or, trust that they're not going to hit anything themselves, or that you don't care, wait a little bit longer, go for a low, maybe a low punch. Trust that they'll get hit by that because they've moved slightly closer, and so on. But the moment you get that situation set up and are moving away, your opponent can't tell if you're going to keep going, especially if they think that you've switched to a defensive mindset. Shimmies are based heavily on, in this game, convincing your opponent that you're done now and you're going to go into defense. But they're hard to do because of the difficulty with the sidestep execution in that specific space. Because once again, remember that if you're sidestepping, you're not usually blocking functionally, which means you're going to get counter hit if you do too many things, so you need to sidestep for only a very short space of time. Don't get discouraged if you get hit during your shimmies. As we mentioned at the beginning, there are definitely tons of tools that beat shimmies. Otherwise it would just be silly. Even something this complex has to have a counter. But as you're not really posing a threat to your opponent, it's almost certainly not going to be a terribly large amount of damage, because then why would anyone ever do it? It would be a large risk for a variable and often not particularly effective reward. The result is that a shimmy often takes minimal damage, someone clips your legs, or if they're really gutsy, they'll run up and throw you or try to throw you. Or as mentioned, do one of those combos that technically tracks you and keeps on advancing, because they're fairly confident that you're trying to do something shimmy related and aren't going to hold the combo. You're going to look for the moment to throw and be wrong. Perfect use of both low stance timing,
What happened to all that spirit you had in
and just enough damage to close it as a result. And as that has closed out that match, we'll have one more match and close out our stream. The lounge itself often stays open a while longer. Today probably will also do that. For Street Fighter fans and fans of bots in general, we now have more information. Capcom didn't drop 4 characters on us randomly all at once. So you're not going to have bot content tomorrow, you're not going to be deluged by what turned out to be a fairly well-predicted sort of leaked list of characters, but it's not terribly difficult to recognize that of the remaining fan favorites, not too many of them were specifically guaranteed, because they simply aren't that either nostalgic or different. So for the Street Fighter fans who somehow missed the announcement and all of the news on Twitter since, Capcom has announced that we will get Rose, Oro, Dan, and Akira from Rival Schools. who I will continue to describe as basically Edgelord Chun or Biker Lucia, depending on your preference of playstyle. At least that's what she was in rival schools. They might do some stuff. This matchup could take a while to explain, so probably I'm going to leave the actual commentary on this to next week. Understand mostly that Ayane doesn't do poorly here because she has so many sweeping moves. And unlike Kasumi, Brad actually does want to do a lot of stuff beforehand. Mainly because Ayane's sweeping moves are so slow relative to Brad's quick reactions that he can get himself out of trouble if she goes to go for them. Making it effectively the opposite of the Kasumi matchup. In Kasumi's case, Brad is waiting, trying not to hit buttons too early, trying not to open himself up. In Ayane's case, Brad is looking for moves he can start that take long to finish. And then, trying to move as soon as Ayane does, from that position. I've started to do this thing, Ayane moved, so I'm doing my own thing now. This is because, unlike Kasumi, Ayane doesn't often have a real way to cut herself short when doing things. She can slow down, but she almost always has to finish whatever she's doing. Meaning that Brad usually has an open moment to land an attack without having to worry about being held or similar. And that's it. We're back up here again, are we? In terms of streams, therefore, you can expect to see stuff next week, Monday, for Street Fighter V as always. And of course, bringing us back to another SixyTimes next week, Thursday. I have a feeling we're probably going to actually have some Tuesday content. What exactly, we don't know. Might get to see some Guilty Gear again. Ah, we're stuck. Of course, this is a perfect time for the game to get stuck as we're probably ending, but no, it looks like it just slowed down terribly. And not for long either. Hopefully, for both players, it cleared up just as much as it did on our screens. Find all of our information on our Twitter 2_MK_FGC. Mostly that's just when we're streaming, and that's usually only like at the moment we're starting the stream. And of course find all our bots at 2-mk.org. Including for this game, even though they're still fairly useless because you can't change character or take matches. Still, they can be helpful to get started in the game if these streams are interesting to you and you want to play it. But with all that said, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.